All right, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Katharine Massam, who is President of the Academic Board here at the University of Divinity, and also, of course, a historian of religion, particularly but not exclusively, Australia, in Australian historical cultures. And she will be, I think, extending some of the ideas, I think, that have been raised so far to think about Australia's place in the renewal of the common good.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Sarah, for that great paper. This contribution begins with a story, and it offers a framework for the common good through an overarching schema about Australian religious thought that draws very much on Wayne Hudson. And then it moves to two brief examples from my own work that show the challenge and the promise of thinking about faith and the common good in this context, I hope. So, the story. There's a legend that was well known in the 16th century concerning a constellation in which the stars formed the 4 points of a cross, and which it was said was once visible in the Northern Hemisphere. This legend is supported by science that goes back to the 2nd century charts kept by Claudius Ptolemy in Alexandria, and to records that were well known to astronomers through the 1500s, including the description of 1524 sent to Venice and now kept in the National Library in Canberra. Ptolemy recorded a crux near Centaurus at the midpoint of his chart, if you can just see it where everything converges. And Andrea Corsali wrote to Venice describing what he had not seen, but predicting the navigators would find, calling it the Southern Cross. Legend and science agree that the stars, now widely known as the Southern Cross, used to shine in the Northern Hemisphere. Until about 400 BCE, they'd been visible as far north as Britain. Then gradual change in the Earth's rotational axis brought them closer to the horizon. And, legend says, they were last seen above the northern horizon near Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. So, when Spanish and Portuguese explorers sailed south into the Pacific and saw the Southern Cross in the night sky, they were not surprised. They recognised a banner of faith, a signal that they were right to call the land they expected to find as the mirror of Europe nothing less than the great south land of the Holy Spirit. The cross was only one way of seeing the stars, of course. Navigators among the Pacifica peoples and Aboriginal and First Nations peoples in Australia had other names. For the Maori in New Zealand, they were Te Punga, meaning anchor. For the Koori and Kulin groups, the dark space between the brightest stars formed the body of the emu, a cosmic spirit protector. For the Ngarrindjeri people of the Coorong in South Australia, these same stars are a stingray just before it encounters a shark coming in from the side. For the Yuid in the West, they are the Mirrabooka, the 4 unmarried daughters of an elder, and his bright eyes watch over them. The constellation was linked with mythic story, as it was for the European sailors. Apparently, British explorers, as well as the Spanish and the Portuguese, also knew the legend of the cross that disappeared into the southern sky, but the British sailors didn't talk about it. What the British explorers saw most clearly when they looked up at the Southern Cross was not a banner of faith, but a clock, a measuring device connected to scientific experiment, an aspect of navigational science. And as the maps replaced Great South Land of the Holy Spirit with more pragmatic labels like New Holland, New South Wales, so the cross was seen more readily and more practically as a chronometer. And of course, the constellation is a navigational scientific clock, but it was also a religious metaphor. That the English-speaking part of our heritage in Australia did not talk about that is typical of the place of faith in our national conversation. Australia, as you probably know, has famously been called the most godless country under heaven. An early European explorer offered the title, and historians have taken it up. Ian Brouard added a question mark when he used the phrase as a book title, but we've been accustomed to thinking of ourselves as a nation where faith has not been a driving force. European Australia was founded after the French Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution, and the grand narratives of our community have been driven forward, we think, on the twin engines of industry and democracy. And even Manning Clark, who came up in the discussion a little while ago, the historian who's written most about Australia, or most firmly in mythic terms, finds very little appreciation of faith in what he calls the land God created on the afternoon of the sixth day when he was very tired and possibly bored. But actually, at the heart of Clark's 6-volume magnus opus, there's a struggle between Catholic Christendom, Puritanism, and the Enlightenment. And although large numbers of Australian historians, especially those writing in the second half of the 20th century, when the discipline really turned its attention to Australian sources for the first time and started telling the national story, whereas many of those historians have seen religion as a distraction and a barrier to social progress, there are profound stories, both of institutions and of individuals, that only make sense if we acknowledge the power of the transcendent in people's lives. Some of those are driven quite explicitly by a commitment to the common good in public life. Wayne Hudson's 2016 work on Australian religious thought does not claim to be a complete social history of ideas about religion in Australia, nor to give a full treatment of how Australian patterns compare to other settler societies. It's full of modest caveats, but it is a major contribution showing the range, substance, and significance of religious thought in Australia. The Arthur Boyd painting on the cover is called The Mining Town, and then in brackets, Casting the Moneylenders from the Temple. And the twin designation makes sure that we don't miss either point. It's one of Boyd's most allegorical paintings, consistent with the personal imagery that runs through his work concerned with love and the oppression of life, death, regeneration, and metamorphosis. And I think Tony Kelly and those who are asking theological conversations to dialogue with the arts would have a good conversation, would find a good conversation with Boyd's work. Wayne Hudson argues that Australian religious thought has often been about ultimate concern, especially as it pertains especially as it pertains to treating others fairly, to achieving just social outcomes, and to recognising intrinsic value in the natural world. Non-material motivations have been powerful. Hudson develops his work around 6 themes. First of all, the extent of disbelief. He makes a distinction between unbelief, where someone cannot accept the claims of faith but might be drawn towards them nostalgically or with some affection, and a more thorough rejection in disbelief, where religious tenets are seen as false and irrational. And it's a testing of the extent of disbelief and finding that it's relatively widespread that occupies the first part of the book. Then he talks about sacral secularity. This is a category that complicates the historiography that assumes a sharp division between the secular and the religious. This sacral secularity is quite different from the 3 senses of the sacred discussed by Charles Taylor. So Taylor's concepts are first the emptying out of religion from public places, then the falling away of religious practice and belief, and then thirdly, the move from a generally shared belief in God to one that's optional for many. Hudson's sacral secularity is more about the entwining of the sacred and the secular, and I think he's right in seeing that as very profound and powerful here. The sacred, or if you like, the non-mundane, is a powerful value applied to the secular worldly matters that did not or do not fall under the church's control. I think if we're looking for an example, then Anzac is a really clear one. He traces it in strands of utopian or republican thought, also in debates about education reform and social welfare, and dimensions of public theology that are concerned for the common good. Then he talks about religious liberalism. It's related to sacral secularity and has a track through efforts of modernising or reforming religious belief and practice, often connected to social reform, and especially before 1945. He says after 1945, it all starts to become much more individualistic, although there's an upsurge in discussion again in the 60s. Hudson's emphasis on Unitarianism is strong here, and the international networks that informed the valorisation of everyday life and the attention to what genuine Christianity required. I think in this category it's where it comes closest to traditional churches. Then he talks about traditions of philosophy that were available to religious thinkers in Australia, depending on their social backgrounds and access to education. He pays attention to the university philosophy departments, especially in Sydney, where there was a strong atheistic push, and in Melbourne, where belief was more incorporated, and to the careers of Max Charlesworth and Kevin Hart in particular. Although overall, Hudson is suggesting that religious thought and philosophy in Australia have not interacted as richly as they might have, there is a conversation to be had here. He pays attention also to the development of theology in Australia. It's a shorter chapter, but it shows the rich and diverse cultural capital that's been part of the exchange of ideas between the academic theologians, the scholars of the church, and the wider community. He notes the neglect of that international exchange in the wider history of Australia's story, and the neglect of the local context in the theological work as well. Australian theology has received little scholarly attention, at least when Hudson was writing, and maybe that's changing. He certainly points to the place that theology deserves to have in what he calls any broad-minded history of Australia. And then he talks about post-secular consciousness, which is a label more than a concept. It's used to describe the changed relationship between church and state, the return to religion after secularity. It describes the attempt to redress the connection between colonialism and secularisation. Hudson uses it to refer to openness to what is beyond a strictly secular or material horizon. And he traces this to the sacral naturalism of the 19th century poets and writers especially, and attention to vitalism in 20th century literature, through process philosophy and environmental philosophy, to the work of Greg Denning and Peter Reid, historian, on the consciousness of place, both of them working in that area, and in what Hudson names as a transcultural eclecticism, where writers accepted the sacredness of the land without understanding the sacredness in an Aboriginal sense. As reviewers noted, the implications in this work for thinking about the old boundary between the secular and sacred and rethinking the Australian past, present and future are profound. So I want to turn now to a couple of examples of people wrestling with the place of religion in historical understanding in ways that fit with Hudson's work. I've argued elsewhere that the wider academy in Australia is doubtful about the place of theology and histories that open out their boundaries to explore belief. In an essay in 2011 that introduces Minoru Hokari's book Gurindji Journey, the distinguished historian Tessa Morris-Suzuki recounts the startlingly different assumptions that this Japanese postgrad had about Aboriginal history. Challenged by Hokari in the course of his fieldwork with the Gurindji near Wave Hill to admit that she respected but did not accept the Gurindji belief that a flood of 1924 was the work of Karaj, the rainbow snake, Morris-Suzuki admits she's making a distinction between myth and scientific explanations. But why do you have a hierarchy of truth Hikari presses, and the supervisor is very troubled. Confronted by this dilemma, she says, my response is to pose a whole set of questions of my own. If I accept irrational Aboriginal accounts of the powers of the rainbow snake as literally true, how can I argue with Christian fundamentalists who tell me that God really made the world in 7 days? If I agree that Gurindji elders have their own interpretation of their own history and that this interpretation is as true as anyone else's, how can I disagree with Japanese revisionist historians who deny events like the Nanking massacre? These are not simple questions. These do not have simple answers, she says. And they're not simple questions. And the exchange is also important because theologically, I think this is a very familiar issue. It's an example of theology and social science speaking past each other. The dilemma is not about hierarchies of truth, but about categories of questions. I'll be interested to discuss this with you. But Christian theologians know very well that Genesis is not science. It's likely that the Gurindji know this too. If myth in Genesis or of the rainbow snake offers theological explanations, why would it match meteorology and agronomy step by step? And as Robert Orsi, the American historian whose books on the lived experience of religion have inspired and broken open new questions since the 1990s, asks, what does it do to Western scientific certainties if we enlarge the categories of understanding beyond them? If sacrament is confused with superstition, theology is in trouble. But Orsi points out that no less an authority than James Fraser in The Golden Bough in 1894 drew a troubling straight line between Aboriginal Australia and Catholicism on precisely the grounds that both were primitive religions. Fraser was at pains to quote Baldwin Spencer's observations on the Arunta people, and he was delighted by Spencer's equation of their life and the sorcery and mumbo-jumbo of Catholicism. So just as Max Weber had seen the enchantment of a sacramental world replaced by the disenchantment of modernity, so many Protestant ethnographers and missionaries held that Catholicism, as an idolatrous religion, had an easy but deplorable bridge to First Nations practice and belief. You will not be surprised to hear that in his compelling account of religious presence, which I have an interesting, oh no, you can see it on the screen there, which is a kind of reflection on 30 years of dealing with lived experience of religion. In that book, Orsi approves of Wittgenstein's complaint about Fraser's Golden Bough, approves of the verdict that the Golden Bough project was simply to recast religious expression into terms that made sense to 19th century British academia, to make it familiar and so to explain it away. If, instead of explaining belief away, we hold to supernatural presence as what Orsi calls an excess of meaning beyond the rational, there's more to say, especially about what is below the surface of what has been traditionally authorised as reliable history. Quite apart from the profound and important epistemological challenge of taking faith seriously in the social sciences, there is more mundane work to do, simply incorporating a deeper and broader understanding of the impact of belief on Australian responses to social questions. For example, and very briefly, I'm interested in the housing and childcare cooperatives founded by the young Christian worker movement in Melbourne in the post-war period. For the Belgian priest, Joseph Cardine, who you can see on the screen, and the young workers around the globe who caught this vision in the early decades of the 20th century, faith lived apart from the world was no faith at all. To them, the lay apostolate was an extension of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It would form disciples in and through their own everyday context and for that context. And you can see his manifesto about that on the screen. I'll just give you a little minute to read that. The study circles that Katharine had founded in Belgium with young women from a clothing factory in 1912 coalesced into a movement by 1922, fanned out internationally through the 1930s, reaching Australia by at least 1932, and also influencing the Latin American theological conversation too, leading into, I would argue, through people like the Boff brothers, an impact on liberation theology. So in a dialectical method that brought faith and experience together through pastoral practice, YCW members were called to reflect on their ordinary experience and respond with considered action, seeking to embody Christ in workplaces around the globe. It dovetailed with a hallmark concept of Catholic theology in the mid-20th century, the church as the mystical body of Christ living out a mission in the world. It was a grassroots organisation that combined an agenda for radical change with both anti-communism and a stance against the Cold War sectarianism of B.A. Santa Maria's Catholic Social Studies movement, which has had so much attention in Australian history. When Katharine visited Australia in 1958 and again in 1966, he was given a hero's welcome. Public rallies, specialist lectures, open-air masses, cathedral celebrations through Australia applauded his international movement, committed, quoting, to the dignity of and purpose of the poorest. By 1966, this included 4 million young people spread through 100 countries, including 550 or more YCW groups across Australia, with an estimated 25,000 members. In 1942, in an acute housing shortage and with the critical need for financial support for young workers, the YCW applied the theological method of reflection on experience, and in a combination of structural change, generous commitment and successful lobbying of state government for new law, it achieved considerable success. They drew on their international awareness of the cooperative movement to establish by 1948 the YCW Trading Society. The Melbourne YCW sponsored 13 cooperative housing societies, a consumer cooperative society, a cooperative credit society, an association of credit societies. The consumer cooperative included a trading division, a building division, an insurance division. The housing societies had 1,600 homes. By 48, they'd built that many since 1945, with finance reserved for another 300. So these societies offered long-term loans at more affordable rates than most other housing financing bodies, except for ward service homes. Ted Long, who, as well as being a football player for North Melbourne, so I'm told, was a very important figure in this movement. He was also a public servant of some talent. And anyway, he articulated a powerful vision for the YCW's role in fostering economic change. He talked about it as a movement of education, service, representation, to bring Christians more closely to unity with Christ the Redeemer. Noting that one of the most damaging factors in the way of that was the economic situation, he says, as you can see on the screen, man has a dignity. To attain that dignity, he is entitled to freedom. Freedom means, among other things, economic freedom. Freedom to choose a job or a career of his own liking, provided he's not opposed to the common good or the law of God. The cooperative is one service the YCW has sponsored in Australia, especially in Melbourne, which is essential to beneficial economic reform. So the YCW instilled a practical theology of work and a fundamental vision of life in which faith sought solutions to the needs and problems of ordinary people. As the notes on the record sleeve of the single they produced for Katharine's visit in 1966 indicate, the YCW founder was honoured not for innovation, but for having restated with uncommon force and genius truths as old as Christianity itself, truths many of us had almost forgotten. The version of the YCW prayer, rendered as all our time, assumed the traditional doctrine of Jesus as the incarnate one, but emphasised even more the dignity of workers called to transform the world by taking on Christ's mission. There's a terrific recording of this, but I am resisting the temptation to play it to you. I am resisting the temptation. It didn't hit the top 10, but it was closer to the hit parade than anything being sung at the time in the parishes. And you can see the sense of mission and commitment that was a rallying cry for the young people involved in this movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine, and thanks again, Sarah. So we do have a bit of time for conversation and question. It occurs to me that the tension between secularism and religion in French society continues today around Islam. And I was just wondering if you might be able to reflect on some of the contemporary debates about that in comparison perhaps with the ones that were taking place in your kind of post-Vatican II or around Vatican II set of case studies, whether you see any sort of similarities or differences there.
Yes, absolutely. Less in the post-Vatican II moment, because I actually focus more on the kind of the lead up to Vatican II. And as I mentioned, these figures came of age in the aftermath of the 1905 separation of church and state, which enshrined laïcité or secularism as kind of a core principle of the French Republic. And those are still the laws that are invoked today in debates around Islam. And so there's a very, very clear connection between that turn of the century. It was called at the time the War of the Two Frances, between the kind of Catholic, usually nationalist, anti-republican, royalist France and Republican, secular, the religious minorities on the other hand. And I do see some super interesting parallels between these two debates, but also some clear differences, obviously. So first is the role of gender. So the debates around Catholicism in France from this period and earlier in the French Revolution, always hinged on the kind of nefarious role that priests played in relation to women, how women were sort of dupes of their priests, how they would, be telling their priests the secrets of the family. This, of course, is related to the feminization of religion since the French Revolution as well, which is sort of key to these conflicts. Which republicanism is seen as more masculine and religion is more feminine. And so because the debates in France today about Islam so much have to do with the wearing of the veil or the burqa, you can see how there's a very clear continuity there. The other thing is the role of schools as the central kind of battleground for these debates. So in 2004, of course, the headscarf was banned in public schools, and it spawned, of course, all this literature about the role of Islam in France and laïcité. And the same thing in the late 19th century, one of the first acts of the new republic that was reestablished after the fall of the Second Empire in 1870, one of the first things it does once it kind of consolidates its power is to secularize the school system. So that it was, that was considered a key site for them because, the church had long been preaching this kind of counter-revolutionary discourse in France. It was not on board with the Republic. And so the Republicans were worried that the Catholics having so much control over education meant that they were effectively kind of creating two youths and bringing up children in this kind of counter-revolutionary culture. And also there's an element of kind of, in some ways, like a xenophobia too, because the priests who were targeted most by these laws were members of religious orders who had their superiors outside of France, because they were seen as a kind of foreign militia in the heart of the nation. And so we see that discourse with Islam today. But of course, the key difference is that Islam is a minority religion in France. It's the religion of, post-colonial immigrants. The position of Muslims in French society is radically different than the position of Catholics in 19th century France. And so in that respect, I think it's totally different. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great answer. Catherine, do you want to swap places with me so that you can see everyone a bit more easily. Any further questions or comments for either of our speakers? Yes.
Thanks, Catherine. Wonderful. A question in relation to your relationship between mythology and science, that was intriguing. In our contemporary world, in relation to climate science actually is often referred to as kind of that's the account of truth, but also it provides a sort of framework for dealing with global problems. And yet the critique in made is that modern science actually is has forgotten its mythical underpinnings. And so I find it ambivalent that the science tells us this is a kind of referred to as a sort of almost a positivistic view that we now accept this. And that kind of, but there's also the anti-science, which is quite perplexing, that there is such a hostility, for example, as to the fact of vaccine. Can you talk a bit about how because I struggle with the fact that the biblical mythology, the six-day creation, is sort of disconnected really with, that doesn't provide a mythic framework for ongoing science.
Yeah. Yes. And it's not ever been intended to, has it? Right? The poetry of the Bible is a completely different genre to the narrative we get out of scientific experiment. Biblical scholars in the room should chime in here. And I think the point that comes through really strongly in the exchange between Okari and Morris Suzuki is this tendency to speak past each other. She doesn't want to accept a whole lot of things that are irrational. But a theological discourse would be speaking in mythic terms about truth that frames the whole thing, that isn't about whether you can predict the flood at Wakefield in 1924 because of the rainbow serpent, or whether it's because of degraded farming and excessive rainfall. I suppose George Gardner would say there would be a meeting of horizons at some point where if you understand the theology about the care of creation and the mythic truth of the wider story, then also the science is going to sit within that. That's the way I put it together for myself, and certainly in relation to the biblical narrative. It's John Wesley who says if you find science and the Bible disagree, then one or the other is wrong. So you're misunderstanding one or the other. So that the ultimate truth that comes from the theological story, if it's authentically theological, isn't ever going to contradict the data from creation if that's accurate. And so it's a matter of getting the genre right rather than trying to force the mythic stories to agree too soon.
Yep, a question
Yeah.
here.
So my question, I guess, is to Sarah, but I'm interested in Catherine's reflections as well. And I was interested in your comments about the changing context in the United States of the influence of post-liberal ideas. And I guess, so my question is, how significant do you think the impact of radical Christian Orthodox views about post-liberalism are being on the Vance-Trump White House? I'll turn those two people around like that. It's a question, about the influence on current United States political culture and practice. And I guess it does relate to a question too about the potential or the lack of potential for those kind of ideas to gain purchase in Australia or not.
Yeah, I might not be the best person to ask about this since I'm a French historian. I think maybe the next panel might have more to say about this. But so I'm not sure exactly what the influence of radical orthodoxy in particular has had on people like Vance. I mean, Trump is something different. But, there are a kind of a whole set of movements, as I understand it, that are all, related but slightly different. There's kind of neo-integralism, which really wants to do away with democracy altogether and go back to a kind of almost like a pre-modern form of political religious interaction. There's Christian nationalism, which is more kind of identitarian, it seems to me. It's like invested in kind of white supremacy. It's very kind of masculinist. And then there are these kind of post-liberal critics. And the thing about the post-liberal critique is that it's, as I sort of say in my book, it's very much kind of neither right nor left. And so it's very hard to place on the political spectrum. And when you look at, especially at figures like Milbank and Kavanaugh, especially someone like Kavanaugh, it does seem like it's more on the left. And then there are people who maybe seem like they're slightly more on the right. And so I think it really depends who you're looking at, but I don't know exactly how much someone like Vance may have read of any of these figures. So I would ask the next panel about this.
I've got a question with it, if there's time. Sarah, when we talk about the nation state, the sources often seem very masculine. I wonder if you've got reflections about where women fit in this conversation about the common good and public policy out of your research.
Yeah, so it doesn't, so gender doesn't come up that much in my own book, in part because I'm dealing with priests, so they don't engage so much with these questions, except in a very kind of abstract philosophical sense, in which sort of the family and especially the relationship between the two sexes is for them kind of the foundation of social and political life. And so there's a lot about the complementarity of the two genders as kind of the foundation for thinking more broadly about society. And that I think is a somewhat maybe problematic way of thinking, especially given the nature of kind of the evolution of gender and sexuality and where we are today. And it's obviously very, very heteronormative. So it's not always very helpful, I think. But there have been these kind of interesting, especially like ecofeminist critiques of some of these figures and the way that, they privilege this kind of masculinist, kind of rational sensibility, and that there could be a kind of feminist answer to that is more attentive to ecology, right, to solidarity. Now, I think there's a danger in kind of essentializing gender sometimes in those conversations, but there's maybe an interesting space there, especially because I do think actually the question of gender is really central to the contemporary political dynamic. I don't know if it's similar in Australia, but I think that is the common denominator between a lot of these sort of far right populist movements.
Thanks. Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Katharine, I'm just wondering, when you gave the example of the YCW groups, why did the further wane?
I think that's the big research question that people need to pay attention to, that we need, that those of us who are interested in that story are puzzled by, but there are some preliminary answers. It was very effective at radicalising people out of the church, and it was seen after the council as a movement from before the council. So there's a kind of almost a power struggle comes through in Stephen Gigach's work between Joseph Cardine and Soonens, Cardinal Soonens, who was Cardine's superior in Belgium, very much for the charismatic movement and the idea that now charismatic forms of lay spirituality will take over, that kind of gathered momentum. And then in Melbourne, but around Australia and the globe, well, in the English-speaking world, in Australia, the radical commitment to the Vietnam moratorium really made some bishops very nervous. And a lot of the YCW chaplains who would have been effective mediators in that conversation had also been were looking to a different future, and many of them had also left active ministry. So there's a kind of convergence of several different crises, some theological or to do with styles of spirituality, and others more political. Yeah, but those are all preliminary speculations, really.
All right. Well, I think that we probably all deserve a cup of tea at this point. We have a little more time, I think, for morning tea, because I think our speaker, Professor Post, is not coming. Is that correct? Yeah.
I did a message back from James Chappell, the other person on the panel, and suggested he might take a little bit more time to relax the general context of post-liberal politics. So he's happy to take a bit more time.
To take a bit more time, that's great.
Still leave us with
plenty of time. That's great. Okay, well, I'll muster you all when it's time to come back in. But we'll be convening in for the dining room for a cup of tea and something to eat. But before that, please join me in thanking our speakers of the